The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the next case was called. People shuffled in their seats, eager to see how justice would play out today. At the center of it all sat Judge William Clark, a seasoned jurist known for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach. His towering frame and piercing eyes commanded respect, if not fear, from anyone who entered his courtroom. Today was no different. His gavel struck with authority as he signaled for the case to proceed. The door creaked open, and a woman walked in. Dressed in modest but well-fitted attire, her confident posture seemed to contradict the vulnerability in her eyes. She was Eleanor Johnson, a local businesswoman and community advocate. Eleanor was no stranger to challenges, but this moment felt heavier. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom seemed to linger on her longer than usual, their whispers barely audible but thick with speculation. Her dark skin seemed to set her apart in a room predominantly filled with lighter tones. Judge Clark barely looked up as he flipped through the case file. "Mrs. Johnson," he began in a clipped tone, "you've been charged with violating local property codes. How do you plead?" Eleanor's voice was steady but soft. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Judge Clark raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. "Not guilty. Interesting. The evidence seems rather conclusive. Do you wish to proceed without representation, or do you have counsel present?" The room fell silent. Eleanor glanced around briefly, as if weighing her options before nodding. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Representing oneself was often seen as a fool's errand, especially against someone as formidable as Judge Clark. But Eleanor stood firm, her calmness baffling even the most skeptical observers. The prosecutor, a young man eager to prove himself, rose to present the case. He laid out the accusations meticulously: unauthorized renovations to a historic property, failure to obtain permits, and alleged safety violations. Each charge seemed to pile on like bricks, designed to paint Eleanor as negligent and irresponsible. Throughout the prosecutor's speech, Eleanor listened intently, her expression unreadable. Judge Clark occasionally glanced her way, as if waiting for her to break under pressure, but she didn't. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of upholding the law, but I also believe there's been a misunderstanding. The property in question was renovated to serve the needs of our community. Every decision was made with care and consideration, not recklessness." Judge Clark's gaze hardened. "Intentions don't absolve you from following the law, Mrs. Johnson. Do you have any evidence to support your claims, or is this just a plea for sympathy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor paused, her eyes locking with the judge's. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. But if I may, I'd like to share the broader context of my actions. They weren't made in isolation, but as part of a greater responsibility." Judge Clark leaned back slightly, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. "Proceed." As Eleanor began to explain her side of the story, detailing the community programs and initiatives she had been spearheading, something shifted in the courtroom. Her words carried weight not just because of their content, but because of the authenticity behind them. Yet, Judge Clark remained stoic, his face betraying no emotion. The session ended with a tense back and forth about permits and regulations. Judge Clark, maintaining his reputation for being stern and methodical, declared that the court would reconvene after reviewing additional documents. As the room emptied, whispers grew louder. Eleanor walked out with her head held high, but the weight of the case loomed large. Unbeknownst to everyone, including Judge Clark, Eleanor's story was far from over. Her role in the community wasn't just as a businesswoman or advocate. Behind the scenes, she held a position that would change the dynamic of this case entirely. As the board chairperson for the city's Judicial Oversight Committee, Eleanor wielded far more influence than anyone in that courtroom realized. And Judge Clark was about to find out. The night after the hearing, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, her thoughts swirling as she sipped her tea. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Papers were spread out in front of her: letters, permits, receipts, and photographs, each one a piece of the puzzle she would need to solve this case. Her calm exterior in the courtroom masked the frustration and disbelief she felt inside. How could something meant to uplift the community be turned against her? Eleanor's mind wandered back to the beginning of it all. The property in question was an abandoned building on the edge of town. For years, it had been a symbol of neglect. Its boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls a reminder of the community's struggles. Eleanor had seen its potential, though. With the help of local volunteers and donors, she transformed it into a vibrant community center. It became a place where kids could study after school, families could gather for events, and local artists could showcase their talents. But not everyone had been supportive of her efforts. Some in the neighborhood, particularly a few influential figures, saw her work as disruptive rather than beneficial. Eleanor suspected that the complaints about permits and codes originated from them, but proving it would be another matter. As she shuffled through her papers, her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up to see a message from her friend Marcus, a journalist who had always been her confidant during tough times. "Ellie, you sure you don't want me to dig into this Judge Clark guy? Something about him feels off." Eleanor hesitated before replying. "Thanks, Marcus, but let's keep this about the facts. I want to win this case on merit, not by questioning his character." She put down her phone and sighed. Despite her firm response, Marcus's words lingered in her mind. Judge Clark was certainly an enigma. He had built a reputation for being harsh but fair, yet his demeanor during the hearing felt unusually personal. It was almost as if he wanted her to fail. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the community center, greeted by the cheerful voices of children playing and volunteers bustling about. This place was her heart and soul, the reason she endured sleepless nights and grueling battles. As she walked through the halls, she couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and dread. Miss Johnson, a young boy no older than 9, ran up to her, holding a drawing in his hands. "Look, I made this for the art wall." Eleanor knelt down to examine the colorful masterpiece. "This is wonderful, Jamal. We'll hang it up today." His beaming smile reminded her why she couldn't give up. This wasn't just about legal codes or fines. It was about preserving a space where dreams like Jamal's could flourish. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor prepared for her next court appearance, Marcus showed up unannounced, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "I know you told me not to, but I couldn't resist," he began, handing her a folder. "This is everything I could find on Judge Clark." Eleanor frowned but opened the folder, skimming through its contents. It was mostly mundane, details about his career, his education, and a few high-profile cases he'd handled. But one detail caught her eye. "Wait," she said, pointing to a line in the document. "He served on the city's zoning board 5 years ago." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, and get this. During that time, they denied permits for several community projects, most of them in predominantly black neighborhoods." Eleanor's stomach turned. This wasn't just about her case. It was part of a larger pattern. But even as the pieces started to fit together, she knew she had to tread carefully. Accusing a sitting judge of bias without concrete evidence could backfire spectacularly. The day of the next hearing arrived, and the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about Eleanor's case, and the gallery was filled with community members, journalists, and curious onlookers. Judge Clark took his seat, his expression as stern as ever. Eleanor stood tall, her confidence bolstered by the support she felt behind her. She presented her evidence meticulously, countering each accusation with facts and documentation. But as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Clark's mind was already made up. When it was time for closing arguments, Eleanor made her plea not just to the judge, but to everyone in the room. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about me. It's about the community I serve and the lives that have been changed because of this center. We followed every regulation to the best of our ability, and any mistakes were not out of negligence but out of a desire to make a difference. I ask you to consider not just the letter of the law, but the spirit in which it was intended." Judge Clark listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Mrs. Johnson," he began slowly, "your passion is evident, but passion does not exempt you from the law. The court will take all evidence under advisement and issue a ruling in due course." As he struck the gavel to adjourn the session, Eleanor felt a mix of relief and unease. She had done everything she could, but the outcome was now out of her hands. As she left the courtroom, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "Ms. Johnson, do you have any comment on today's proceedings?" Eleanor paused, her mind racing. Finally, she said, "I believe in the truth, and I believe in justice. Whatever happens, I stand by the work we've done for our community." But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the battle was far from over. And as Judge Clark sat in his chambers, reviewing the case files, he came across something that made him stop cold. A letter stamped with the official seal of the city's Judicial Oversight Committee, signed by none other than Eleanor Johnson. His grip on the paper tightened as he realized the significance of what he held. This was no ordinary defendant, and for the first time in his career, Judge Clark felt the weight of uncertainty press against his chest. The air was thick with tension as Judge Clark sat alone in his chambers, the silence of the room interrupted only by the faint sound of the courthouse clock ticking. He stared at the letter bearing Eleanor Johnson's name, his mind racing. How had he missed this? As chairperson of the city's Judicial Oversight Committee, Eleanor had the power to scrutinize not only the judiciary's conduct, but also his decisions. He couldn't help but wonder if she had deliberately hidden this information, though a part of him suspected it was his own oversight. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the framed law degree on the wall. For years, he had prided himself on being impartial, unyielding to pressure. But this case felt different. It wasn't just the scrutiny Eleanor's position implied. It was the unwavering resolve she had shown in court. She wasn't the desperate defendant he had assumed her to be. She was calculated, determined, and, if he was honest with himself, a formidable opponent. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat in her office at the community center, her thoughts just as restless. She hadn't intended for her role as board chairperson to become part of the narrative. Her position wasn't a weapon, it was a responsibility. Yet she couldn't ignore how it might shift the power dynamic if Judge Clark became aware of it. The question was whether she should use that knowledge to her advantage. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. This fight wasn't about ego or power. It was about justice. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Marcus again. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I found something else. Remember those zoning decisions from when Clark was on the board? Turns out one of the projects he blocked was proposed by your late father's nonprofit. Ring any bells?" Eleanor froze, her chest tightening as the memory resurfaced. Years ago, her father had worked tirelessly to create affordable housing in their neighborhood. The project was his dream, a legacy he hoped would uplift generations. But it had been crushed by bureaucratic red tape, leaving him disillusioned and heartbroken. She had been too young then to fully understand. But now it all made sense. The denial had come from the very board Judge Clark had served on. "Are you saying he was directly involved?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say for sure," Marcus replied, "but his name is on the meeting minutes. He was there when the decision was made. If you connect the dots—" "I can't make this personal," Eleanor interrupted, though her voice wavered. "This has to stay about the case." After hanging up, Eleanor sat in silence, her emotions swirling. The past she thought she had buried was colliding with her present in ways she hadn't anticipated. Could it really be a coincidence? Or was there something deeper driving Judge Clark's approach to her case? At the same time, Clark found himself drawn into his own web of memories. The name Johnson stirred something faint but persistent in the back of his mind. Late into the night, he sifted through old files from his time on the zoning board, scanning for clues. When he stumbled upon the minutes of the meeting Marcus had mentioned, his heart sank. There it was, the affordable housing project proposal led by Arthur Johnson. Clark remembered the meeting vividly now, the arguments against the project framed as preserving the character of the neighborhood. At the time, it had seemed like a rational decision. But as he read the details, he began to see it for what it truly was, a thinly veiled excuse to protect the interests of a select few. His gut twisted with unease. Had his actions back then indirectly hurt Eleanor's family? And if so, was he now compounding that harm by how he was handling her case? Days passed, and the courtroom remained the stage for growing drama. The prosecutor, emboldened by Judge Clark's seemingly strict stance, began to press harder. He introduced evidence of minor oversights in Eleanor's renovation plans, trying to paint a picture of carelessness. But Eleanor countered each point with precision, her calm demeanor unshaken. The community members in the gallery grew visibly restless, their support for Eleanor palpable. Amid the escalating tension, a new subplot emerged. One of the volunteers at the community center, a young architect named Sophia, approached Eleanor with unexpected news. Sophia had discovered discrepancies in the city's permit database, applications marked as denied without explanation, many of which were for projects in marginalized neighborhoods. "This isn't just about you," Sophia said, her voice trembling with urgency. "It's a pattern. Someone's been systematically blocking progress in our communities." Eleanor's heart raced as she studied the documents Sophia had brought. The implications were staggering. If this information was accurate, it pointed to something far larger than her case, a network of decisions designed to suppress opportunities for people like her. But how could she introduce this evidence without derailing her defense? If she accused the system itself, she risked turning her case into a political spectacle. Yet ignoring it felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. The next court session was unlike any before. The tension in the room was almost tangible as Eleanor presented her closing arguments. She spoke of the community center not as a building but as a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a sea of challenges. She acknowledged the technical errors in her permits, but argued that they were minor compared to the good the center had achieved. As she spoke, she noticed Judge Clark watching her intently. His usual stern expression had softened ever so slightly, though his eyes remained guarded. She wondered if he was beginning to see her not as a defendant, but as a person. When the session ended, Eleanor walked out of the courtroom, her steps heavy with uncertainty. Marcus was waiting for her outside, a rare look of optimism on his face. "You nailed it in there," he said, "but there's more we need to dig into. This case isn't just about you, Ellie. It's about the bigger picture." Eleanor nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning, and it wasn't one she could fight alone. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, both Eleanor and Judge Clark found themselves staring into the unknown, their paths converging in ways neither could have anticipated. As the final court date loomed closer, the city buzzed with whispers about Eleanor Johnson's case. It had become more than a legal battle. It was now a symbol of the community's struggles and resilience. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs and chanting slogans in support of Eleanor and the center she had built. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, and her name became a rallying cry for change. Inside his chambers, Judge Clark felt the weight of the spotlight more than ever. He was used to making tough decisions, but this case had taken a toll on him. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law anymore. It was a battleground for ideologies, emotions, and history. His reputation as an impartial judge was at stake, and yet, for the first time, he questioned whether his own biases had colored his judgment. He couldn't stop thinking about the zoning board decision from years ago. It haunted him, not just because of what it meant for Eleanor's father, but because of what it revealed about the system he had been part of. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that Eleanor's fight wasn't just her own. It was a fight against years of entrenched inequality, the kind he had unknowingly helped perpetuate. The night before the hearing, Judge Clark sat at his desk, staring at the case file. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside him, growing cold as the hours ticked by. He had read and reread every piece of evidence, every argument. And yet, something felt unresolved. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he had a duty to uphold the law. On the other, he couldn't ignore the broader context of Eleanor's actions and what they meant for the community. Across town, Eleanor was also preparing for the next day, though her preparation looked different. She was surrounded by supporters, volunteers, and friends who had come together to help her finalize her defense. Sophia had continued her investigation into the city's permitting process, uncovering even more inconsistencies that pointed to systemic bias. The evidence was damning, but introducing it in court would be risky. It wasn't directly related to Eleanor's case, and bringing it up could be seen as a diversion. Marcus paced the room, his phone in hand. "Ellie, we have to use this," he said, waving a stack of documents. "This is bigger than your case. If we expose this, we could force the city to address the corruption." Eleanor shook her head, her expression firm. "I can't risk it, Marcus. If I bring this up now, it'll look like I'm deflecting. This isn't the time or place." "But when will it be the right time?" Marcus pressed. "This could be our only chance." The room fell silent as everyone looked to Eleanor. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I've made my decision. Tomorrow, I'll stick to the case. After it's over, we'll figure out how to handle the rest." The tension in the room was palpable, but no one argued. They trusted Eleanor's judgment, even if they didn't fully agree with it. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Eleanor sat at the defendant's table, her face calm, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Judge Clark entered the room, his usual stoic expression in place, but there was something different in his eyes, a heaviness, a hesitation. The prosecutor opened with a final statement, reiterating the charges and arguing that Eleanor's actions, while well-intentioned, had violated the law. He painted her as someone who believed she was above the rules, someone who had prioritized her vision over the safety and order of the community. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of the law. I understand that rules are in place to protect us. But I also understand that sometimes the system doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes the rules themselves are part of the problem." She paused, letting her words sink in. The community center wasn't built out of arrogance or carelessness. It was built out of necessity. Our neighborhood needed a place where children could feel safe, where families could find support, where hope could take root. Every decision I made, every risk I took, was for that purpose. As she spoke, Judge Clark felt a knot tighten in his chest. Her words were powerful, but they also cut deep. They forced him to confront the role he had played, however unintentionally, in creating the very barriers she had fought against. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for understanding. I'm asking for justice, not just for me, but for the community this center represents. Because if we don't stand up for what's right, who will?" The gallery erupted into applause, but Judge Clark quickly struck his gavel, restoring order. "Silence in the court," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. As the proceedings drew to a close, the room was filled with an almost unbearable tension. The fate of Eleanor and her community center hung in the balance, and no one, not even Judge Clark, knew how it would end. But as he looked out at the faces in the gallery, at the people who had come to support Eleanor, he felt the weight of his decision more acutely than ever. When he adjourned the court for the day, the room buzzed with speculation. Reporters rushed to file their stories, and supporters crowded around Eleanor, offering words of encouragement. Judge Clark retreated to his chambers, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had to make a choice, and he knew that whatever he decided would have consequences far beyond the walls of his courtroom. The courthouse emptied slowly, its hallways still echoing with the murmurs of heated discussions and reporters' rapid footsteps. Eleanor stood outside in the brisk air, her supporters surrounding her, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. Marcus lingered nearby, watching her closely. He could tell she was holding herself together for everyone else, but inside, the weight of the trial was crushing her. Before she could retreat to the quiet of her home, a young woman approached her cautiously. Eleanor recognized her as one of the clerks who had been quietly observing the case from the back of the courtroom. The woman hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Miss Johnson," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think you need to see this." She handed Eleanor a small folded piece of paper and disappeared into the crowd before Eleanor could ask any questions. Marcus noticed the exchange and hurried to her side. "What was that about?" he asked, eyeing the paper in her hand. Eleanor unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as she read the few words written in hurried, uneven script. Asterisk, check the permits issued under zoning case 473B asterisk. What's zoning case 473B? Marcus asked, peering over her shoulder. "I don't know," Eleanor said, her voice low. "But I think we need to find out." That night, Marcus and Sophia worked late into the evening, combing through city records. It wasn't easy. Many of the files were incomplete or buried under layers of bureaucratic jargon. But finally, they found it. Zoning case 473B was tied to a property development project from 5 years ago, one that had been greenlit despite multiple violations. The developer had ignored safety protocols, displaced several families, and left the project incomplete, yet somehow their permits had been approved without question. Sophia's voice was tight with anger as she read through the documents. "Look at this. The same board that denied your father's project approved this disaster. And guess whose name is on the approval committee?" Eleanor's stomach sank as Sophia pointed to a signature at the bottom of the document. Arthur Clark asterisk. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "So Judge Clark wasn't just involved in denying your father's dream. He helped push through a project that did real harm to the community." Eleanor felt a wave of conflicting emotions: anger, frustration, but also confusion. If Clark had been complicit in something so blatantly corrupt, why was he coming down so hard on her now? Was he trying to prove something, or was he afraid of what her case might uncover? The next morning, Eleanor debated whether to bring the new discovery into court. It was a gamble. If she presented it as evidence, it could shift the focus of the case and potentially expose Clark's past actions. But it could also backfire, painting her as someone desperate to discredit the judge rather than defend her community center. As she entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The gallery was packed again, and even Judge Clark's seemed more reserved than usual. The trial resumed, each argument feeling sharper, more urgent. The prosecutor pressed hard, highlighting every minor infraction in Eleanor's permit applications, while Eleanor countered with facts and appeals to the greater good. But just as the session was about to close for the day, something unexpected happened. A man in a dark suit entered the courtroom and handed a note to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Clark. The judge read it, his expression unreadable, before addressing the room. "We've received an urgent motion to introduce new evidence," he said, his tone measured. "Miss Johnson, do you have anything to say about this?" Eleanor's heart raced. She hadn't filed a motion, so who had? Before she could respond, Marcus stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I filed the motion. The evidence is directly related to this case and sheds light on the systemic issues that have led to these proceedings." The room erupted in whispers as the bailiff retrieved the documents from Marcus. Judge Clark scanned them briefly, his face remaining impassive, but Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw. "We will recess until tomorrow to review this new material," Clark announced, striking his gavel. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor confronted Marcus. "What were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "I was thinking that the truth matters," Marcus shot back. "You're fighting this battle with one hand tied behind your back. If we don't expose the corruption behind this system, what's the point?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She knew he was right, but she also knew the risk they were taking. If the evidence was dismissed or seen as irrelevant, it could undermine everything she had worked for. As night fell, Judge Clark sat alone in his chambers, the documents Marcus had submitted spread out before him. The evidence was damning, not just for the city but for himself. It revealed a pattern of decisions that prioritized profit over people, decisions he had been part of. He felt a knot of dread tightening in his chest. He had spent his career believing he was a fair and just arbiter of the law, but this case was forcing him to confront a different reality. The system he had upheld wasn't as impartial as he had once thought, and his own actions were part of the problem. The next day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. As Judge Clark took his seat, his usual air of authority seemed muted. The room waited in hushed anticipation for his ruling on the new evidence. But before he could speak, Eleanor stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'd like to address the court before we proceed." Clark nodded, his expression unreadable. "You may." Eleanor took a deep breath. She knew this moment would define not just her case, but her entire fight for justice. "This case isn't just about a community center," she began. "It's about what happens when people in power forget the purpose of their power. It's about a system that too often works against the very people it's supposed to protect. I'm not here to accuse or deflect. I'm here to ask for accountability, not just for me, but for all of us." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the courtroom was silent. But the battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Eleanor's powerful words had set the tone, and now all eyes were on Judge Clark. He sat at his bench, his face a mask of calm, but inside he was anything but. The new evidence had unraveled threads he had spent years trying to ignore. It was more than just a case now, it was a reckoning. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "The evidence presented raises significant questions about systemic inconsistencies in our zoning process. However, this court is bound to focus on the case at hand." His gaze flicked to Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Johnson, your actions were born of necessity and good intention. The law remains clear about the requirements for permits and compliance." Eleanor's heart sank. She knew this speech. It was the kind judges gave before delivering bad news. She braced herself, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "However," Judge Clark continued, his tone shifting slightly, "irregularities in the city's zoning and enforcement practices cannot be ignored. It is clear that your application was not treated with the same consideration as others, and this court believes justice must account for context." A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, but Judge Clark wasn't finished. "While this court finds you in technical violation of zoning regulations, I'm issuing a conditional ruling. The fines will be suspended, and the community center may continue operations provided it works with the city to address any remaining compliance issues." Gasps and murmurs filled the room as Eleanor sat frozen, trying to process what she'd just heard. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. Her supporters erupted into cheers, and Marcus clapped her on the back, grinning. But then Judge Clark raised his hand, silencing the room. "Before this case is officially closed, I must address an additional matter." His voice dropped, heavy with gravity. "The evidence presented yesterday implicates several officials, including myself, in actions that have undermined the integrity of this city's processes. Effective immediately, I will be stepping down from my position as judge and cooperating fully with any investigations into these matters." The room went silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Eleanor stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of shock, gratitude, and a strange sadness. Judge Clark had been her adversary, but his decision to step down felt like a genuine attempt to make amends. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity. Reporters rushed to file breaking news stories, while Eleanor's supporters surrounded her, celebrating the unexpected victory. But amidst the chaos, Eleanor's thoughts kept returning to Judge Clark. As the crowd began to thin, Eleanor approached him. He was gathering his things, his once imposing figure looking smaller somehow. "Your Honor," she said, her voice hesitant. He looked up, his eyes tired but warm. "Eleanor," he replied, dropping the formalities. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for doing the right thing. I know it wasn't easy." Clark nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The right thing rarely is, but it's never too late to try. As Eleanor walked out of the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the crowd that had gathered to support her. It wasn't the end of the fight. There were still permits to fix, systems to challenge, and a community to uplift. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt hope. Just as she reached the steps, Marcus called out to her, waving a phone in the air. "Ellie, you're not going to believe this." "What is it?" she asked, hurrying over. He handed her the phone, a news article glowing on the screen. The headline read, "Asterisk Anonymous Whistleblower Exposes Citywide Zoning Corruption Scheme Asterisk." Eleanor's eyes widened as she skimmed the article. It detailed years of backroom deals, bribes, and misconduct in the zoning department. Everything Eleanor and her team had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. The article didn't name names, but it was clear that someone with inside knowledge had decided to come forward. As she handed the phone back to Marcus, a thought struck her. She turned to look at the courthouse, where Judge Clark was stepping into a car. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment she wondered. Had he done more than just step down? Had he been the one to blow the whistle? The question lingered, unanswered, as the car pulled away. Eleanor smiled to herself, the mystery only adding to her newfound determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but now she had momentum, and maybe even an unexpected ally.